Thank you for listening to the Chronicles of Christendom, a survey of medieval literature, by me, Mom Chilo. This podcast is dedicated to bringing light to medieval stories and viewing them from a traditional Christian perspective. I hope you enjoy this episode. Hello everyone, so today we're going to be looking at some Georgian hagiography, and the date for this is going to be around the 9th or 10th century. So if I'm not mistaken, I believe that this will make this episode the earliest text that we've covered on this show. Specifically, the work that we're looking at is called the Balavariani. If I'm pronouncing that right, I'm not too sure. Not too sure to pronounce Georgian that well. But this text was written in Georgian. We have the Georgian manuscripts, which you can find in the Jerusalem Patriarchate Library. So it was written by Georgian monks who were in some monastery outside of Jerusalem, most probably the St. Sabas Monastery. However, it's not too clear which monastery exactly it was because there were quite a few monasteries around Jerusalem during the Middle Ages. But regardless, it seems pretty obvious that it's from around the 9th or 10th century. But I don't really want to go any more into the manuscript history until the very end and some of the background around this text, just because there's some, I don't want to say controversy because there's not really much controversy. However, I'll say there's a lot of sensationalism, shall we say. So you'll have to wait to the end if you want to hear me talk about that, where I critique some people who make such a big deal out of this text, when really they shouldn't be making such a big deal out of it, in the way they are at least. The only other thing I want to add is that there is a shorter version of this text, like an abridged version, and that's called The Wisdom of Balahvar, and it seems to be written or compiled about 100 years after the original text was written. I'm not really going to compare the versions, really, because I don't think it matters that much, but in the version I'm using, or the translation that I'm using, there is a couple of lacunae or kind of missing folios in the manuscript, and the compiler does at times use the wisdom of Balahvar to fill in some of the gaps in the main text. So besides that, let's just get into this. So since this is a hagiography, we shouldn't be too surprised that the very first thing that's in the text isn't the story, or the life of the saints, or the saint, or saints actually, plural, but rather it's a hymn to the saints, or specifically to Saint Iodasaph, the king of the Indians, as he's called. And it really reads like an akathist. If you've ever read an akathist before, it kind of has that similar structure and style. It's not exactly that structure or style per se, but it kind of reads like that. It's very obviously a hymn that you would pray at home, or even within a church setting. And it might be copying other sorts of hymns that do a similar thing, or in terms of the lives of the saints, which is not at all surprising. I mean, that still happens today. It's actually kind of encouraged, if anything. But in this hymn, and it is quite long, not crazy long, but it takes up a couple of pages of text. It kind of gives a summary of the entire story. And I'm not going to give you the summary here. We're going to go through the text, but that's the first thing about this, is that it very much is a hagiography, and it even includes a prayer you can say to the saint of the story. So our story starts out by introducing us to King Abanes in India. So he has this kingdom in India, and he's a very fervent pagan. He's very caught up in worldly desires, worldly power, lust, all these sorts of things. A very worldly man. However, he's also very, pious, at least in the pagan context. He has all of his idols, he does his sacrifices, he hosts the festivals, he does the whole thing, right? But also in his kingdom, there's a growing Christian population who live quite opposite to him. And these Christians, they're not just more or less normal people, but they just worship God, or, instead of the idols. Rather, there is a very monastic, not even tinge of, a very explicit monastic character to most of these Christians. A lot of them live in the wilderness, and a lot of them live very ascetic lives, even in the city, and they live a much, much different life than the pagans do, and they're very obvious to spot. And then after some time, the king begins to persecute the Christians, and he tries to expel them from his kingdom. And in the midst of all this persecution, one of his top knights, abandons all of his wealth and his status, and he tries to convert the king to Christianity. And he gives out a long defense for Christianity. And the main line of attack that he has is that the world might give you some things that you might enjoy here and now, but it's all perishable. It's all going to go away, even within like the pagan worldview. You have your wealth here and now, you have your pleasure and joy here and now, but you don't really get to take it with you to like whatever version of the next life they have, if they even have some form of that. However, with Christianity, you do get to have something in the next life. However, that often entails that there are certain pleasures you have to forego now temporarily in order to gain, eternal, more blissful pleasures. So I'll read part of it. He says, "So now I am denouncing this world to you, O king, and warning you away from it, because it takes away what it gives a man and grudges what it bestows upon him, and afterwards sends him away heavy laden with sin. It strips a man of his apparel until even his privy parts are exposed to scorn, and then dresses him up in shame and reproach. It degrades that man whom it has raised up until his enemies trample him under foot. It deceives those who submit to it, hates those that love it, tricks those that are loyal to it, overturns those that lean upon it, ruins the hope of those that put their trust in it, and turns into bitterness the joy of those that rejoice in it. And nobody can escape in peace once he has fallen in love with it." And then a little bit later, he says to him, "But a man who knows and values the world everlasting places his faith in eternity and in those good things which fall to the saints in time to come. He therefore feels no hostility or envy towards his fellow men, nor does it occur to him to do so. For many are those who desire to dwell in that abode which was promised to them by the only Son of God, begotten by his Father, which is in heaven. These are my brethren and my friends whom I cherish and uphold, but those whom I once deemed to be friends and brothers have turned into my bitterest enemies. This is why I have quitted their company and embarked on the quest for peace." And this absolutely enrages the king. So this knight, he gives up everything, his status, his money, his wealth, and he goes into the wilderness after he kind of gives the speech to the king. But the king is just even more furious, and he ramps up his persecution of Christians. And then the king has a son, and because he is a good pagan, he summons all of his astrologers together to predict the boy's future. And they all agree, and they say, "This child shall attain a reign of glory with regal majesty such as nobody has ever achieved in the land of India." But then the wisest astrologer among them says, "My verdict is that the glory which this child shall attain is not the glory of this world, but I believe that he is to be a great guide upon the road of truth." And the king, because he wants his son to also grow up in wealth, power, and enjoy the things of this world, he's very saddened by these words. It says that he was filled with sorrow, and his joyful mood left him entirely. And then this is what he does to try to counteract what the astrologer said. He ordered a city to be built for his son in a place set apart, and the child lived inside it. And the king detailed trustworthy servants to stay with his son and look after him and afford him every indulgence. When the boy grew up in body and intelligence, Abanes, the king, replaced these men by other retainers, warning them not to make any mention in the prince's presence of death, of disease, or of eternity, neither of righteousness nor of sin, neither of old age nor of youth, neither of poverty nor of wealth. If any one of the attendants should fall sick, he was to be speedily removed, so that the boy might not catch sight of him. All these measures the king took so as to prevent the prince from seeing anything which might give him cause for wonderment, and thus lead him to make inquiry about the faith of the Christians. So in order to make the prince not aware of any bad thing and make him just think that life is just it can just be pleasure and enjoyment, he basically creates this like pleasure dome for him to grow up in. Even if somebody gets sick, they have to be replaced by somebody else, because the boy can't even see that sickness or death exists, or else he might start asking questions and perhaps become a Christian. But eventually the boy grows up a bit, he gets a bit older, and then he asks one of his tutors, he asks him like why his father won't let him out, why he has to be so confined. And then his tutor tells him, like, look, there was this astrologer who predicted this thing about you. And then there was these Christians, and he kind of gives him a vague idea of what these Christians are. He doesn't go too much into depth and but he does mention how his father, kicked them out and persecuted them. And then the boy then asks his father if he can leave and see the world around him. And his father agrees. However, he tells the servants that when they take the boy out, they need to basically clear the roads of any sick people, any poor people, any trash, anything that might, give you a reminder that the world is, perishable and passing. And they're only to take him to places that are beautiful. So the servants do this, and they start taking the boy out occasionally to go and see around the world, or at least around the city, or outside of his little, pleasure dome. However, one time, I guess they get a little bit lazy, and they don't fully clear the roads, and they encounter a blind man and a cripple. When the boy saw them, he was filled with abhorrence at the sight of them, and made inquiry from his retainers concerning them. They said to him, "These are men who are stricken with infirmity, just as other men also are stricken. That first man's deformity springs from some internal ailment, whereas the other's blindness is also the result of disease." The boy said to them, "Is this the fate common to all men?" They answered, "Not to all, only to certain ones." Again the youth asked them, "Can one foretell on whom this calamity shall fall, as well as knowing who will be spared from it?" They answered him, "Some it attacks and others escape it, but this cannot be determined by human volition." The lad said to them, "So there is nobody who can be really assured that it will not befall himself?" They replied, "There is no one." Then he began to brood and to meditate. He was disturbed in mind, and his complexion changed color, and he returned home weighed down with melancholy. So the sort of ruse that his father has set up has kind of failed now, because he's seeing these people who are, sickly and blind. And then he goes out a couple other times and he meets some other people who have other, various ailments and whatnot. And he begins to realize that in the world there actually is really bad things, and we don't really have control whether or not that happens to us. The prince says, "No longer is there any sweetness in this transitory life now that I have seen these things, and no one has any respite from sudden or gradual death. Gradual and sudden death are close and lead together. Day follows hard on day inside the month. The year follows hard upon the heels of the month. Soon the years themselves must pass away to drain a man's life from him, even if he succeeds in living out the full span of human existence." So he had earlier been told a little bit about the Christians who sort of abandon the world and live a much more ascetic life, who renounce the world. But now he really wants to speak to them, especially in light of realizing that there's all this death and illness and decay in the world. And it's here when one of the monastics who lives out in the wilderness, because most of the Christians now are living outside of the kingdom in the wilderness, mostly as hermits or in some form of monastic community. So the one who hears about this, and it's kind of implied that he learns about the king's longing through some form of noetic gift. He doesn't hear about it necessarily physically or in person. Rather, God somehow reveals this to him. So the name of this man is Balahvar. And Balahvar kind of concocts this ruse in order to be able to get an audience with the king's son by himself. So this is a common trope that you see in medieval literature, even some ancient literature stuff. You see this as well, where if you want to, talk with, or sneak in somewhere, one easy way to do that is just to disguise yourself as a merchant. Like we saw this in our 4-episode series that we did on the Welsh, branches of the Mabinogi. Specifically, we saw that happen in the 4th branch. But regardless, Balahvar, he takes off his monastic robe, his monastic garments, and he puts on basically a merchant garb. And then he goes to the boys, I guess his pleasure dome, walled city or whatever. And he says to some of the servants there, he says, "Look, I'm a merchant, and I have a very valuable gift in this little box here." Or not necessarily a valuable gift, but a valuable, a valuable something in this little box that I have. And I want to be able to show it to the king, or rather to the prince. And then eventually, after some talking, they allow him to go, and then he gets a private audience with the prince. And then once he starts talking to the prince, he reveals to him, look, this isn't an actual gemstone or anything. Rather, the gift that I have is something much more cosmic, something much more eternal. It's like the gift of salvation, I guess you could say. It doesn't exactly say what the gift is, but you can kind of imply that it's like Jesus or like the message of the gospel, something like that. So he's like, look, I heard you want to learn more about Christianity, and here I am. I'm here to, tell you about the Christian faith. So he tells him about the Christian faith in a form of like a catechesis, I guess you could say, right? He's teaching him the very fundamentals of Christianity, but he doesn't do it through some form of like treatise style where it's like, look, there is like the logos and there's like the Trinity and there's like the three persons and this is how it all works out like logically. Rather, he gives him a series of parables. And some of these parables are just lifted straight from the Bible. Like one of the parables is just the parable of the sower, which I'm pretty sure is just like a literal word for word, transcription of the Bible. And this actually makes up the bulk of the text. These parables, or not necessarily even the parables, but also just the conversation with Iodasaph and Balahvar. It makes up most of the text. Most of it is in parables, but there's also some dialogue in between. And even though it kind of presents itself as one cohesive episode, it's actually implied that this was over multiple visits, that he was visiting him multiple times. So we just have a sort of like highlights or kind of best of Balavar's sayings here. So I'll read one of them for you. This transitory life and all that cherish it resemble a man pursued by a raging elephant, which cornered him inside a fearsome abyss. As he fell down inside it, he found two branches growing out over the precipice, so he hung onto them and then managed to establish some sort of foothold. When he looked around him, he descried two mice, one white and the other black, which never ceased to gnaw at the roots of those trees on which he hung. Then he looked down into the chasm and noticed a dragon, which had parted its jaws and was intent on swallowing him up. And on the ledge on which his feet rested, he discerned 4 heads of asps projecting from the cliff. Then he lifted up his eyes and saw that a little honey was dripping from the branches of the tree, and he began to eat it. And its flavor and sweetness so entranced him that he no longer worried about the perils which beset him and the fact that he might be bitten to death at any moment. As for the branches on which he was suspended, he saw the tree's roots being gnawed away by the mice, and, most dangerous of all, the dragon lying in wait to swallow him up, but all this failed to trouble him in the slightest. Now, that elephant is the harbinger of death, which pursues the sons of Adam, and the abyss is the world, full of all manner of evil and pernicious snares. The 2 branches are a man's lifespan, and the 2 mice, one white and the other black, are the days and nights that fret away at it incessantly, and suddenly sever the thread of a man's life. The 4 asps signify the 4 elements from which a man's body is constructed, and when a single one of them is destroyed, life comes to an end. The dragon which opened its jaws and longs to swallow him up is the image of hell, into which the lovers of this world enter after their death. And those few drops of honey are the brief delights of this world, by which it deceives those who are led astray by the sweetness of corruption. So a lot of his parables are like this. It's about the dangers of, putting your trust in the world and not putting your trust in God, or getting too caught up in worldly pleasures and then forgetting about, your impending doom. Now, in some of the later versions of this story, like in Greek and Latin and even like Old French, the parables take on a much less like monastic context, I guess, because it seems like in this version, this really early Christian version, a lot of the emphasis of the parables is on the temporariness of this life. And there's not really a lot of talk about like sacraments or more other like theological things you could talk about in a sort of catechesis. However, in those other versions, you not only see the emphasis on, how transitory this life is, you can die at any moment, but there's also like talk about the Eucharist and other sacraments. Whereas in this whole hagiography, I don't think there's really any mention of the Eucharist, for instance, or any other sacraments. Like I think there's talk about baptism. But outside of that, I don't think anything else like that appears. But I think we need to consider genre, right? So this is a hagiography. It's not necessarily a treatise, right? Like these Greek, or rather these like Georgian monks, they would have known how to have written a treatise, right? However, they're explicitly not doing that. They're writing hagiography. However, nonetheless, there are still elements of like didacticism in here, like a teaching in here. And there's a little bit actually about apologetics, but we'll get more into that here later. So after Balahvar has told him all these parables and Iodasaph has been open to them, Iodasaph finally says, "No longer has my mind any love whatever for this world, nor will I occupy myself any more with its affairs, but I long for the eternal life and intend to cleave to you and follow you wherever you go and endure the austerity of your way of life." So he's essentially saying that he wants to become a Christian and also become a monastic and go into the wilderness. Balahvar then starts to attack the idols, and then he gives the rather standard sort of critique against idolatry, both Jewish and Christian, right? Which is essentially that idols promise you everything but give you essentially nothing. So he likens idolatry to somebody who believes that a nightingale, so it's like a rather small bird, believing that a nightingale can lay an egg the size of an ostrich egg, which is a massive egg, larger than the bird itself. Both of them are ridiculous because the bird can't lay an egg that's bigger than itself. In the same way, a wooden or golden statue that can't even help itself up when it falls down, how is that going to protect you from, foreign invaders or whatever else if it can't even protect itself? And he points out the irony in the fact that the king has these guards around the idols, and yet the king says that the idols are their defenders. He then informs him of how the devil can attack you. So he says that the devil has two methods of attack. He can either attack from the left flank or from the right flank. And this is pretty standard Christian symbolism, so you can, if you know a thing or two about this, you probably already know where this is going. However, the left flank, the devil essentially tells you, hey man, look, like you don't really need to be a Christian. Look at all these great things you're missing out on. Look at all these worldly pleasures and delights that you can partake in. Just go partake in those things, And maybe he'll even say to you, you can even still be a Christian. You can just like repent tomorrow. And then if that doesn't work, he can then attack from the right flank. So the right flank, the sins of the right hand. This is when the devil takes almost the opposite approach. Instead of trying to get you to indulge in your passions in like a kind of like worldly passions, like lust, anger, gluttony, whatever. Rather, he makes you despair of your salvation. He basically says, "Oh, look, you call yourself a Christian, that you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do any of these things." We saw a good example of this in when we covered the Anglo-Saxon hagiography of Saint Guthlic. So if you remember there, Guthlic is tempted by the devil when he's out in the fens, kind of in the wilderness by himself. And at first the devil tries to tell him, "Oh, look, aren't you so hungry? Just eat. You can eat all this food or whatever." But then when Guthlic doesn't succumb to that, the devil then tempts him and he says, "Look, you're not holy. You need to fast even more than you already are fasting now." Even though St. Guthlic created a very strict rule for himself that he would eat once a day. But the devil said, no, don't eat once a day. Just don't eat at all. In order to try to tempt him into sin that way. And now the last thing that Balahvar teaches Iodasaph is apologetics. And specifically, it's apologetics that works when you're arguing against pagans. So he says, like, look, one God must exist because everything needs to have a creator. And then when it comes to the resurrection, his defense of the resurrection is that he points out that there's all these people, all these apostles who are these real people who we have testimony of and we have evidence of. We have, the laying on of hands. We have the apostolic succession. We have all these men who gave up luxury. They gave up their lives. They were tortured because of the witness that they saw. And then other people subsequently suffered likewise because of the witness of their witness, and so on and so forth. And he says, now if they, like the apostles, had been false prophets of God and liars, they would not have led men along such narrow and difficult paths. They would sooner have offered them vistas to delight human nature, and show them a broad path and a spacious gate, such as would please the eyes and captivate the heart. They would have pandered to their enjoyments and lusts, and encouraged them in gracious living, and won over men's hearts by this kind of approach. they would not have alarmed people by their prayers, fasting, and endurance in travail, and by treating both rich and poor on a footing of equality. That is how we know that they speak true, and their deeds also testify to this, for no ordinary mortals could manifest such marvels and signs as they. So it's interesting, really, how this apologetic is still a common apologetic that you see nowadays, right? Where it's like, look, man, like people wouldn't just lie about this. You don't lie about something and then get tortured and be threatened with crucifixion and then still hold on to your lie. Like they would have, say, yeah, I was just making it up or whatever, right? But they didn't. And so even all the way back here in the 9th or 10th century, these writers are talking about this sort of apologetic. So before Balahvar leaves to seek out fertile ground to sow, as he puts it, he says that he has another calling somewhere else that he has to fulfill. He gives Iodasaph one final sermon on the Christian faith before he goes, and then from then on, Iodasaph becomes a Christian and he begins to secretly pray. We're told that he stays up in all-night vigils and he fasts. Yet he's still in his his father's pleasure dome. The king, his father, eventually learns that Balahvar was teaching his son, and he consults with his advisors on what to do. His advisors say that they should find Balahvar and then host a debate with him in front of the prince, and then that way the prince will see the delusions of Balahvar, right? So they go out searching for Balahvar, but they can't find him, and eventually they resort to divination, but it's really no help because the oracle says that they'll find Balahvar, but then they never, find Balahvar. So, you get a little bit of making fun of pagan divination here. So they eventually find some Christians out in the wild, out in the wilderness, like these monastics who left the city due to persecution, but even they don't know where Balahvar is. Those Christians are then dragged before the king, and he basically threatens them with death, saying, "You need to tell me where Balahvar is." But they say that they're not afraid, and that they really don't know, and that they're not afraid that the king is going to kill them after, because he threatens them with death. So the king just chops off their hands, their feet, and he plucks out their eyes, and he kind of just leaves them to their own devices. So the king's men finally, though, they find someone who, it's not Balahvar, but someone who looks a lot like him. And they make him take the Christian side in the debate. They tell him, what's going to happen, and they say that he needs to basically fumble the debate or else they're going to kill him. And then one of the king's kinsmen, by extension also one of the kinsmen of the prince, hears this, and he's like a secret Christian. And when he learns of this ruse, he tells the prince what is going to happen. But before the debate actually begins, or before it's even brought up to the prince, the king goes to his son, and he basically tries to speak reason to him personally. And he confronts him over his Christian faith, saying that, how he's abandoned him, even after he's given him all the pleasures of the world, and how he's to inherit this kingdom and all these worldly riches. So he says to him, "You proud and willful young fellow, I shielded you from contact with common humanity and kept you apart from all suffering so that you might enjoy honor and ease. I protected you from the snares and instigations of the devil." So just as an aside, it's an interesting note that even the pagans believe in the devil or some form of evil spirit. So he continues, he says, "I have pampered your body with tenderness and your eyes and ears with delight and have spared you all occasion for worry. All this for your personal benefit, but you are puffed up with audacity and find pleasure and ease irksome. In your ignorance you chase after suffering and privation." And then he goes on and on, kind of, lambasting him for trying to give up all the wealth and everything that the king has given to him. And then towards the end of his monologue here, he says, "But now you are oblivious of the sweetness of this life, because you have never yet experienced the bitterness of that existence after which you quest." So he's basically telling him, he's like, look, my son, you've lived in this pleasure dome your entire life. You don't even know what it's really like to be, or to live like these Christians do. And he tries to appeal to him that way. But then Iodasaph answers him. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but part of it says, "The career in life which you chose for me would be fair and beautiful indeed, but for the fact that it passes speedily away. If you can be certain that it is permanent, it is exceedingly good and desirable. But since you cannot guarantee this, why should you not forgive me if I choose to renounce it, thereby to attain the life which is most to be desired? Why are you astonished, O king, at my yearning for eternal blessings, rather than being amazed at your own attachment to the transitory pleasures of this world? So then the king says to him, so they have this long exchange, but at the end of it, he says, "My child, what you have said has intrigued me and converted me to your point of view, but not really, as we'll see. Now I must inquire into your words without delay, and investigate them calmly. If they turn out to be true, then they will shine forth the more brightly in the course of my examination. But if they be false, their error will be shown up. So I propose to gather the people together and hold a debate in a spirit of equity, not of violence. I will command the herald to proclaim an amnesty to all the Christians who belong to your faith, so that they may come to my assembly for a just verdict to be reached here in the presence of the whole nation. Nobody must have grounds for imagining that I have used coercion or for declaring, had I attended that assembly myself, I should have uttered a triumphant oration by which the entire people would have been quite convinced and our cause completely vindicated." So he's kind of lying through his teeth here and saying, look, I'll hold a fair debate between the pagans and the Christians, and then we'll see, who has the better arguments. And I'll make it so that everyone, can make the argument they want to make, and there won't be any force or any deceit. But we know that's a lie, right? Because we know he's going to get a fake Balahvar to rig the debate. So thereafter, they begin the debate, they host the debate, and then the king says, he makes an announcement before it begins, and he says that he'll destroy the idols and the devotees of the idols if they are proven wrong. And then Iodasaph, he says, remember, he knows the ruse that's happening. So he says, "O king, you've spoken so well." And in a similar manner, if the Christians lose, then he's going to kill the quote-unquote Balahvar. Although, of course, he knows that it's the fake Balahvar. So this puts the fake Balahvar, and his name is Nakor. It puts him in quite a situation, right? So it's kind of a, if he loses, then he's going to be, killed by the prince. However, if he wins, then the king is going to be mad because he didn't do what he was told and making the Christians look bad. So regardless, the debate goes on, and then the fake Balahvar starts winning the debate. And then they agree to postpone the debate for later. And then Iodasaph speaks with Nakor, the fake Balahvar, and he seems to be a true Christian. So Nakor actually does seem to be a Christian, but kind of like a secret Christian. And Iodasaph says, "Hey man, look, I know you're not the real guy here. I know you're a different person." And then he actually helps him escape once he realizes that he isn't a true Christian. He actually helps him escape to the wilderness to be with the hermits. Now, when the news about Nakor reached King Abanes, he fell into despair, the story says, now that he had lost all hope of converting his son through Nakor's agency. So the king deferred for a time the debate with his son and began to despise the cult of the idols and express contempt for them on numerous occasions, as well as lack of respect for their acolytes. However, he could not quite bring himself to adopt the way of God's service for himself. Iodasaph, for his part, treated the king with friendly kindness, as Nakor had advised him, and never rebuked him for his behavior. So the king does seem to have at least somewhat of a change of heart. He starts to despise the idols and the people who worship them. But then when there's a festival for the idols that's coming up, and the king is supposed to make an appearance and, give money for the festival and all that, some of his, people, some of his servants realize that he's not, that enthusiastic about the whole festival. So they find this hermit, like a pagan hermit, rather. His name is Thedma, and he's supposed to be, one of the great, pagan wise men who worships the idols. And he comes to the king, and he basically re-strengthens his faith in the idols. And he does this by demonstrating that even he, who believes in the idols and doesn't believe in the Christian faith, the Christians want to say they've renounced the world, but in a sense, he's also renounced the world, yet he still, worships the idols. And then, the king goes to the festival and, helps fund it and all that. But Thedma also tells the king something else. He says that if the king wants to bring his son over to the idols, to paganism, then he needs to do it with the help of the pleasures of women, shall we say. So he gives him like this fable. He reads him this like parable, and then he says, "Look, we just need to have these women seduce him, and then he can come over to our side." So the king replaces all of Iodasaph's servants with these beautiful women who are told to sing and to entice the young prince. And then we learn from the story, it says, "Now among these girls was a certain king's daughter, who had been brought as a captive to King Abanes. She was fairer than all the others, and more intelligent than they. And the prince fell in love with her because of her beauty and wisdom, since she was extremely clever and resourceful. The prince would often discuss religious problems with her and talk of the transitory nature of this world, reminding her of God and condemning the errors of the idolaters. When the king heard of this, he was delighted to hear of Iodasaph's love for this maiden, for he imagined that he would prevail over his son through her influence." Then the girl says to him, she says, "If you want me to pay heed to your exhortations, O prince, then grant me but 1 year's solace in your arms. I promise you that I shall then confess your faith, and both of us will serve your God until our death." And then Iodasaph's like, no, because, what if I die during that time, and, all these things could go wrong. And then she eventually convinces him to just spend one night together, and then after that, she will then convert to Christianity with him. So they plan to start like the next day, but then he goes to sleep, and then he has this dream. So Iodasaph has this dream of heaven, and he sees all the joys of heaven. And then he has this image of hell, and all the tortures that are there in hell. And then after that, when he wakes up, he calls it off with the girl and says, "Look, we're not going to do this." And we're told that all the women looked ugly to him after he saw the vision of heaven. So then he consults again with his advisors about what to do and how to, bring his son over to their faith. And then they, talk to him, and then they kind of realize that it's really bad if the heir is one religion and then the king is another religion. And then in a sense, you have this divided kingdom. And they're like, having a divided kingdom religiously is really bad. So they suggest to him that he splits his kingdom with his son and just gives his son his half and allows him to rule it as he pleases, letting Christianity flourish there if he wants to. And then the reason why the king consents to this is because he thinks that, once Iodasaph has this temporal power, he's then going to succumb to pleasures and the things of this world and abandon his Christianity. So the king goes to Prince Iodasaph and he says, "I, my son, although I am a king, am also a man. My heart is tender towards you, as is the way with all men towards their children. I cannot go on opposing you any more than I can oppose my own will. You have brought down great evil upon my head and your own. But my main wish is to bring this matter to the most successful conclusion possible, to do what you desire, and to seek to cure you and myself in peace and tranquility. So now I appoint you king over half my realm. Administer it yourself as you will, only let not our enemies mock, nor the envious rejoice at your estrangement from me, nor let me be completely without posterity from you, lest your extinction make me suffer death before my time comes to pass away. But if you make your kingdom prosper and manage your affairs skillfully, my soul will not altogether desolate because of you, and may your doings be attended perpetually with peace, good health, and success." And the prince at first is like, no, I don't want this, all these things. I want to, go out to the wilderness and be a monk with the hermits. But eventually he relents. He says, okay, fine. And part of it is because he realizes that he can bring back Christianity and let Christianity flourish again. So then the king summons all the lords and all the people together, and he tells them, "We, all of us, once belonged to a different creed and a different religion from that to which we now adhere." So here he's speaking of paganism. He's saying we're now pagans, but we once used to be of a different creed. All of our ancestors, monarchs, renowned for their good qualities, and all the nation too used to live according to a different creed from our present one. But we have given preference to a religion different from their original creed. Though we have no doubt that had our forebears been alive today, they could not have devised any body of doctrine for us to adopt now they are dead. Now, all of you grandees know about my son's behavior. In fact, news of it has spread throughout the entire people. And then, he goes on to say, I'm giving him half the kingdom and he's going to rule over that. But the reason why I quoted that part in the beginning is because he mentions that the people, so like his ancestors, so older Indians, used to follow a creed that wasn't his, so a creed that wasn't paganism. And this, to me, seems to be a reference to St. Thomas the Apostle, because there's a lot of tradition, as well as there is some writings that we have from like the late ancient period and like early Christian writings about how Saint Thomas went to India to spread the gospel there, and how he was the first to bring Christianity to India, which many people accepted. So it seems to be a little bit of a throwback to Saint Thomas when he says, they used to have a different religion than we do now. I think the idea is that they have, in a sense, regressed back to paganism, even though, St. Thomas once came to India and evangelized there, because everyone in the medieval world would have known that, St. Thomas went to India and spread Christianity there. So the writers of this hagiography are kind of explaining why, even though St. Thomas spread Christianity to India, why now it is, or relatively recently, it was full of pagans. And they're saying that there was some, large apostatization is kind of the implication here. So Iodasaph is made king, or at least he's given half the kingdom, and people are allowed to go to whichever kingdom they want to go to. And the prince also, or now the king now, Iodasaph also obtains all the prisoners who were in the prisons, and he frees all the Christians, and he deals justly to all those who were, in the prison for other crimes. And then he also distributes to the poor, and he doesn't really take a fancy palace. Instead, he builds I think it says a moderate dwelling for him to live in. And he also sells everything that his father gave him, all the regalia, the gold, the gifts, and all that. He sells that to, further give to the poor. So his father's plan for him to be corrupted by the riches of the world once he obtained power isn't really coming to fruition. He also, and this is interesting, so one other thing that he does is that he appoints bishops. And this is interesting because there's a lot of controversy around whether or not kings or emperors are able to appoint bishops, especially in the West around 1000 or so. There was a big controversy called the investiture crisis. We talked a little bit about that in our episode on Saint Stephen of Hungary, and how the text kind of takes the imperial side, saying yes, actually kings are allowed to appoint bishops, because it has King Stephen appointing bishops, and it defends this practice actually. But it's interesting when we look at some of the other versions of this text, there's a Greek version and an old French version. They're not a one-to-one translation. It's kind of a retelling in the local language there. And in both the Greek and the French text, it actually says otherwise, so it doesn't have him appointing bishops. In the Greek text, it says he reconstitutes a bishop or something like that. Whereas in the French text, the old French text, it actually says that John of Damascus, who had earlier lost his see as a bishop in Damascus, was made bishop, or became a bishop over that area. But it kind of steers clear of saying that Iodasaph anointed him a bishop. And so this is, I'll talk at the end why it's John of Damascus, but it is just to note that John of Damascus was not a bishop. So interesting. Anyways, he also builds a bunch of churches, and lots of people get baptized, and of course, he legalizes Christianity, and Christianity starts to flourish there. We're told that the superiority of Iodasaph's excellent system became evident as compared to his father, and people began to revile their original religion to which they formerly adhered. All men's hearts were filled with affection for him, and with good wishes for the success of his reign. The works and renown of Christianity, of God's service, and of love and peace became manifest to the people, for Iodasaph himself set a shining example to all men of humility, love, and devotion to duty. There was nobody left in all his realm serving a different religion from that of God, the ruler of all things, except for a few individuals who departed and settled in the kingdom of his father, Abanes. These were idolaters who could not bring themselves to adopt the faith of Christ. So some people go to his father's realm so that they can continue serving the idols. So while Iodasaph's kingdom is doing quite well, his father's, on the other hand, isn't doing so hot. So the people start to turn on King Abanes, and he fears that there's going to be a revolt. So in a sort of twist of fates, he actually writes to his son for advice. And his son basically tells him that you need to do justice. And if you do justice, do what is just, then the people will begin to love you. And then the king, along with his advisors, because he also consults his advisors on what to do, and then they eventually come to the conclusion that this hardship stems from breaking a promise he made with the gods. So specifically, the promise was that when he was trying to get a son, I guess he was having trouble to, his wife or whatever was having trouble conceiving. And then so he made a promise with the gods that if they give him a son, he will give him his entire kingdom. But he didn't do that, right? He only gives him half the kingdom. And their thought process is that because they only gave half the kingdom, the gods who, we're told, they're not happy if you break a promise with them or a covenant with them. They're being upset, and that's why there's all this uprising and kind of unrest in the kingdom. But Iodasaph isn't yet willing to take over the entire kingdom like his fathers have, because he sees having a divided kingdom, divided on religion, as a very bad thing. So he says to his father that they need to have, if they can come to one religion and, unite the realm religiously, then, he might take the entire kingdom and then rule it. So King Abanes, he sends some wise men to Iodasaph who are to discuss with some of the Christian monks, and they're supposed to figure out the whole religious thing. And now this time there's a much better faith that's going on. Like, this is actually in good faith, unlike the original debate where there's all the conceits and deception going on. So he tells them that, they're supposed to be without partiality. They're supposed to judge each religion without partiality and then come to a conclusion. So the pagans kick off the discussion. They say, before making any inquiries from you, like the Christians, we will inform you of our principles. We serve idols of gold and silver and images of stone and wood. Now pray inform us who it is that you serve. And then they respond, we serve the life-giving God who created us and also created gold and silver, stones and wood. You know his name and cannot deny his might. He is chief and supreme over all, and no one can attain to his divine majesty, nor can anyone describe him in words or see him with their eyes. He gave us birth and vouchsafed to us knowledge of himself. We do his will to the best of our ability, and what is distasteful to him, that we avoid. And then as the conversation goes on, the Christians keep continuing making the point against the idols. They say, look, you worship, wood, stone, and gold, but our God made all those things. And then the argument kind of goes that, they admit that the gods can't really create them, or the gods did not create them. Why do they even worship them? And then finally, the idolaters, they give up. They concede that the Christians have the better argument. And then they go back to King Abanes and they tell him about their conclusion. And then they all get baptized, including King Abanes, and they become Christians. Basically, everybody in the realm gets baptized except for Thedma, that sort of a pagan monastic or a pagan ascetic that we mentioned earlier. But even here, Thedma, he goes up to them and says, why are you converting to Christianity? All this stuff. And he tries to debate them saying, look at what good the idols have done for us. And he starts exalting these material things. But then Iodasaph says to him, he says, if it is true that, the idols are good because they give us all these material things, they give us honor and glory if you're a king or whatever, right? He says, if all those things are good, then how come you live a life of asceticism? How come you give up all those things if you're saying the reason why we should worship the idols is because they give us these good things? So Thedma then asks them, how can you confirm the testimony of the apostles and the prophets, seeing that you have never set eyes on them? Then Iodasaph says to him, he says, I can confirm it by the fact that everywhere, in lands far separated from one another, their testimony has been accepted, even by kings of differing creeds who were at enmity with one another, and between whom no agreement existed. Although I have not set eyes on the apostles and the prophets, I know of them from incessant reports which cannot be discounted, and wherein there can be no conspiracy to deceive, for they emanate from remote places, and in the east and the west, the south and the north. Glory is offered up to the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and their sacred law which God's holy and elect apostles preached. How could there have been any prearranged collusion between all these witnesses? And then another argument that he gives is he says, look, when people want to become, gain a following or attraction, it's not really a good strategy to say, oh, you have to give up all these good things in life that you have. So that kind of adds credence, the argument goes, to the preaching of the apostles, as well as, if you look at how they suffered. And he makes arguments that are very kind of similar to arguments even Christians today make. When like atheists or whomever ask, "Oh, how can you trust the apostles?" It's like, well, if they were just making all this stuff up, why did they stick with their lie even while they were being tortured? If they just said, "Hey, I just made it all up," don't kill me, don't crucify me. So the argument goes like, why would they keep to a lie to their very death if they knew it wasn't true, right? So it's just interesting that there's very similar arguments being made. But Thedma, thankfully, actually, finally gives up, and he yields, and he himself becomes a Christian as well. So shortly after there, King Abanes dies, and after 8 days of mourning, he says that Iodasaph says that he's abdicating as king to become a monk. So he leaves and goes into the wilderness, but Barakiah, so this is the guy that informed Iodasaph of the plot with Nacor and the fake Balahvar earlier, who's one of his kinsmen. He was the one who Iodasaph makes king afterwards. But eventually he goes out and searches for him in the wilderness, and he begs him to come back, saying, you need to be king and all this stuff. But then Iodasaph says that he won't. But he gives him, some advice on how to rule, do justice, love God, and, and everything else follows, that sort of thing. And then Iodasaph puts on Balavar's old garment that he gave to him a long time ago. And then he finally finds Balahvar in the wilderness after searching for him for 2 years. But he's essentially on his deathbed. Balahvar is on his deathbed. And when Iodasaph starts to lament the fact that he is dying, Balahvar tells Iodasaph, he says, "Fear not, Iodasaph, for Christ our God is your helper. Sorrow not at my departing, but be glad, for I have been delivered from future sins. Be glad, Iodasaph, for you have disposed of the earth and acquired the heavens. Be glad, Iodasaph, for you have become worthy of apostolic grace. Be glad, Iodasaph, for you have won many crowns of witness and of travail through your labors and feats of endurance." And then he kind of continues to praise Iodasaph, saying, "Look, you've done all these great things, and don't worry about me. I'm going to a better place." And then eventually Balahvar passes away. And then after some time, Iodasaph also passes away. And then the last thing that the story says is that after some little time, Iodasaph too passed away and entered before Christ's presence, borne on the wings of the Spirit. And a certain holy man dwelling nearby came and laid Iodasaph's corpse by the body of Balahvar. Then he went to the land of Sholites, which is their kingdom in India, or his former kingdom in India, and told King Barakiah everything which he had seen. The king arose with a great multitude and came to that place together with his princes, and bore away the bodies of both the saints, and enclosed them within urns adorned with gold. And Barakiah laid these relics within a hollow church dedicated to the worship of the Holy Trinity, and exalted them with every mark of honor. Many who were rendered infirm by grievous ailments were delivered from them by these relics, which constantly wrought miracles. And the king and all the people saw this and glorified Christ our God, who readily grants success in all things to those who love him. For to him belong glory, honor, and grace, and adoration, together with the Father, who has always no beginning, and the Holy Spirit, giver of life, now and always, and for all eternity. Amen. So that wraps up the story here. So we see very clearly that both Balahvar and Iodasaph are saints, and that their bodies, their relics, perform many miracles. So now that we've gone through the story, I want to give a little bit of background. I didn't really want to give this background in the beginning because, how do I say this? There's a lot of sensationalism around some of the background of this text. And that's because this story is indirectly through a couple of different links related or based off of the life of the Buddha. And that's why I said there's a lot of sensationalism around that, because a lot of people, like these, academics, these scholars, they want to say, oh, look, this is like the Buddha is a Christian saint. Like, even if you read Guy de Cambrai's French version of this on the Penguin edition, the subtitle is something like The Tale of the Christian Buddha, when that's really just not the case. So the way that this story gets passed down, generally speaking, the general established genealogy, it's not too clear, but I think it goes something like that there was the original life of the Buddha, or rather there were several of those lives going around. But Buddhism is much older than, the incarnation of Christ by about 400 to 500 or so years. So I think the Buddha generally is accepted to have died somewhere around 400 BC. So you have a lot of these, and Buddhism was really popular. Like, it spread all the way to Mongolia, Afghanistan. It was much more popular and extant than it is nowadays. And largely that's thanks to Islam, which heavily suppressed it. But as I was saying, there was all these lives of the Buddha. Buddhism was a really popular thing. And then eventually there's an Arabic version that gets called Balahvar and Iodasaph. So the Iodasaph was originally Buddhasaph, which was Buddha, right? Or whatever, however you say it, whatever, local language. So this was written around the 800s AD, and it's kind of like an Islamic version, which kind of removes the Buddhist trappings of the text. And it was very popular in the Middle East, like along Islamic communities. It was especially popular among the Shia community in Islam, and they were even making, they even made their own like Shia version in the late 900s. But then the Georgian monks in Jerusalem, they somehow get a copy of what might be the Arabic version, or they hear of the Arabic version, and then they make a Christian version of this in like the 900s or so. And then in the manuscript, it says that the story comes from a certain Saint John, or rather just John of Saint Sabas Monastery. And the most famous John of Saint Sabas Monastery is going to be Saint John of Damascus. However, it's not clear that it's referring to John of Damascus specifically. And of course, academics have scrutinized whether or not it was John of Damascus, specifically pointing out that Saint John probably didn't speak Georgian, right, or write in Georgian. However, this could have been an oral thing, right, an oral tradition, and we do know that Saint John did speak and probably even write Arabic as well. So it's not unheard of that maybe Saint John heard this story and then related it orally to somebody else, or somewhere around those, something along those lines, because the dates do match up, or at least enough where Saint John could have potentially been one of the original sources for the Christian version, or somehow influenced it. But then there's a Greek version which appears in the early 1000s in Mount Athos. And in the writings of St. George the Hagiorite, he attributes the translation to his spiritual father, St. Euthemius the Hagiorite. And again, when I say translation, it's a very loose translation, I guess you could say, where they kind of add stuff, remove stuff, change a couple things around to their liking. And in the Greek version and the Athonite version, they add a lot more stuff during the when Balahvar is giving all of his parables and instructions to Iodasaph. They make it a lot more sacramental. There's a lot more theology, and even some quotations by some church fathers as well are added. And we do know that Saint Euthemius was Georgian, and he did translate many things from Greek into Georgian, including the Bible, or at least parts of the Bible. But we don't have anything that we know of besides this text where he takes something from Georgian and translates it into Greek. But there's no reason, he could not have done that, right? He had all the skills and time and, specialty required for that, right? But in the Greek, they changed the name. So instead of Balahvar and Iodasaph, it becomes Barlaam and Ioasaph. And then soon after, there is a Latin translation, again, translation loosely speaking, by some monks in southern Italy. And then there's another Latin translation in the 12th century, which becomes really popular in the West. Eventually, it even makes its way into the 13th century Golden Legend. And the Golden Legend is this a compendium, or this compilation of all these lives of the saints. And it's one of the most popular medieval texts that we have. In terms of the number of manuscripts that we have, even more than the Bible sometimes. So a very popular, work the Golden Legend is. So we get various, after that, after the Latin version, the popular Latin version is translated, we get various vernacular and sometimes abridged translations. The most famous of these is the 13th century Guy de Cambrai's version in Old French, which I mentioned earlier. Even though it's not really an abridgment, it's a pretty meaty work there. And it is kind of contextualized with regards to the Crusades as well, which is interesting. And during the Latin translation, the names changed to Barlaam and Josaphat. So they're then actually made saints. So they're actually canonized in the West by Pope Sixtus in 1583. And they were made saints much earlier in the Georgian church. And then later the Greeks also canonized them. And you can actually find in the East icons of these saints, normally around the 13 to 1400s in Serbia, as well as in some of the monasteries in Mount Athos. So a lot of people have made hay over the fact that the story originates from a tale of the Buddha. However, I think if you understand Christian symbolism well enough, you can see why this really isn't an issue, right? So we have these stories of these saints, and that's what this work is trying to do, is trying to explain their story through hagiography. And, people can say, well, maybe they didn't really exist, right? Because, well, we know that this didn't happen historically or whatever. However, I think there's something much more deeper going on in this hagiography. It's trying to say that, even in India, in terms of medieval cosmology / cosmic geography, it's considered the far end of the world, right? Along with Ethiopia. In fact, Ethiopia and India are used interchangeably, and they both refer to the very edge of the world. So even in these far-flung lands, in the Far East, Christianity still reigns there, or at least it can reign there. It's not just a European or a Middle Eastern thing. This is a universal religion. However, it's always contextualized within a specific time and place, geography, and all that. However, Christ is universal. So make of that what you will. I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you so much.